At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, on August 10, 1944, the iron door of the holding barracks groaned open, a long metallic wail that sent a chill rippling through the room. Inside, 20 German women, some nurses captured amid the fall of the Afrika Korps, others auxiliaries taken in Italy, froze in place. Their breaths hitched, eyes wide, as the echo of heavy boots marched closer down the corridor. For weeks, Nazi broadcasts had filled their minds with fear. Tales of American cruelty, of starvation, violation, and merciless punishment. So when the guards' fists slammed against the steel frame, panic broke loose. Some screamed, others pressed themselves against the walls or sank to their knees, whispering desperate prayers, waiting for terror to burst through the door. But what entered the room was something they could never have imagined. The soldiers carried no weapons drawn, only bars of Hershey's chocolate, their silver wrappers glinting in the dim light. The Americans offered them wordlessly, awkwardly, with faint, uneasy smiles, as if this simple act might somehow bridge the abyss between enemies. At first, no one dared touch the sweets, convinced it was a cruel deception. Then, slowly, one young nurse, 21-year-old Liesel from the Luftwaffe Medical Corps, reached out, broke off a piece, and took a bite. The taste of sugar, long vanished from wartime Germany, melted on her tongue. Her eyes filled instantly with tears. Fear dissolved into confusion, then into something far more dangerous to every lie she had been told. One after another, the others followed. The sound of sobs replaced silence as they ate, overwhelmed by the realization that the monsters they had been taught to hate had handed them kindness instead of cruelty. That moment would mark the beginning of one of the least known yet most transformative stories of the German POW experience. The journey of women who expected torment, but found instead a kind of humanity that would forever change their view of the world. Spring sunlight spilled over the broken ruins of Tunis in the final weeks of 1943, and with it, illusion began to die. For months, German women serving as clerks, radio operators, and nurses across North Africa had been assured that capture was unthinkable. Berlin's propaganda insisted that the women of the Reich would never fall into enemy hands. And if they did, their honor would be destroyed. Yet when the Afrika Korps finally crumbled in May, that fiction collapsed with it. Columns of exhausted soldiers trudged into Allied captivity. Among them nearly 100 women who had bandaged wounds, filled reports, or kept the machinery of the German army turning. They were not fighters, but they had worn uniforms. And so, prisoners they became all the same. Shame went hand in hand with surrender. Some male comrades sneered at them for being captured alive. "We were looked at," one woman later wrote, "as if surviving itself were a betrayal." The whispers of fear grew louder. What would the British do to them? What about the Americans? But the first encounters did not bring humiliation. Instead came food, cigarettes, and even medical care. The seeds of doubt began to take root, not through speeches or threats, but through acts of simple decency. Weeks later, they were assembled at the Algerian port of Oran, gathered beside tens of thousands of weary German prisoners. The air shimmered with heat, and the horizon was filled with the silhouettes of ships, liberty vessels, vast and steel gray, waiting to carry them across the Atlantic. The women climbed the gangways with trembling hands, clutching rosaries or folded prayers, believing the voyage would be their end. Their fear was justified. The Atlantic still swallowed ships whole in 1943. Submarine attacks were a constant terror. Some wept as the African coast faded into the haze, convinced they would never again see European soil. Life aboard the transport ships was rough, cramped, and suffocating. The bunks were stacked 3 high, the air thick with salt and sweat. Seasickness swept through them like a tide. But amid the misery, something else appeared: astonishment. Every morning they were given rations that defied belief. Soft white bread, unmarked by ration stamps, steaming cups of real coffee, meat and fruit, sometimes even sweets. At first, they pushed the trays away, certain it was theater, a psychological trick meant to deceive them. "They want us to think America is rich," one woman whispered bitterly. But as days passed and the food never changed, their skepticism began to crumble. This wasn't a show. This was ordinary life for their captors. Lying in their bunks at night, the women whispered in disbelief. Some insisted the rations must have come from England, a rare stockpile to mock them. Others admitted quietly that they hadn't seen bread this fresh since before the war began. One young typist, Margaret, scribbled in her diary, "If this is the food of our enemy, then Germany has already lost. They waste more than we ever had." Her words, smuggled home years later, would stand as quiet proof of the moment the illusion of superiority began to collapse. The voyage dragged on for 2 weeks, storms battering the hull while depth charges thundered in the distance. Each distant explosion sent them clinging to each other in silence. Yet the ship pressed forward, and daily life found its rhythm. Scrubbing decks, queuing for meals, exchanging shy glances with guards who seemed barely older than themselves. Sometimes, when the sea calmed, those same guards would show them photographs. Mothers, sweethearts, sisters, pointing from the faces in the pictures to the women before them. It was a gesture that needed no translation. Humanity had quietly crossed enemy lines. And then one morning a cry went up from the deck. Land! Norfolk, Virginia rose before them, sprawling, immense, alive with motion. The docks stretched farther than the eye could see. Towering cranes lifted endless crates. Freight trains rumbled across the port. Automobiles glittered in the sun. Every worker seemed to own one. Dockhands, clerks, even mechanics. To the women staring from the rail, it was like glimpsing another world. For years they had been told America was decaying, a nation of mongrels and chaos, choking on its own excess. But what they saw instead was power, organization, and unimaginable abundance. And in that moment, as they stepped off the ship and onto American soil, many of them realized, without a single shot being fired, that the war had already been lost in ways their leaders would never admit. It was hard to believe that a single harbor could outmatch the entire German war industry. Yet here it stood before them. "We thought it had to be an illusion," recalled Liesel, the young Luftwaffe nurse who weeks earlier had been the first to taste American chocolate. Everywhere there was noise and motion, cranes, machines, lights, as if the entire land existed only for war. And still no one looked hungry or afraid. He pointed to their faces, then to the women standing before him, as if to say without words, "You are like them, and that is why we treat you as such." The language barrier mattered little. The message was clear. Kindness, hesitant and clumsy, had entered the space where fear was meant to rule. For days afterward, that single encounter rippled through the camp like a whisper from a dream. Some dismissed it outright, insisting the Americans were softening them for some crueler purpose. Others held onto it like a secret prayer, replaying in their minds the taste of melting chocolate, the scent of citrus, the awkward gentleness in a soldier's eyes. The diaries from that time speak of emotional collapse more than comfort. "I wept uncontrollably," one woman wrote. "The guard apologized because there wasn't enough milk for everyone." Imagine that, an enemy saying sorry for not feeding us enough. The change wasn't instant, but it had begun. The first fracture in years of indoctrination had appeared. Each knock at the barrack door no longer froze them with terror. It sparked curiosity. What would it be this time? A basket of fruit sent from a nearby church. Newspapers printed in German, distributed by American intelligence but devoured nonetheless. Sometimes it was nothing more than the guards lingering to practice broken German, laughing at themselves when words twisted wrong. And in each small moment came the same realization. These men were not monsters. They were ordinary, sometimes painfully shy, shaped by a world of comfort and effortless humanity. Everything the Reich had sworn could not exist. The sensory memories clung hardest. One woman described the shock of tasting real milk again, rich, cold, alive on her tongue. Something German cities hadn't seen since 1941. Another recalled laughter erupting as a young guard tried explaining baseball through pantomime, nearly tripping over himself mid-pitch. These weren't moments of degradation. They were fragments of normal life piercing captivity like sunlight through cracks. By autumn, The rhythm of life had changed. Fear had softened into wary calm. They still remembered the day of arrival, the terror, the screams, but now, when boots echoed down the corridor, there was a hush of anticipation instead of panic. Some even straightened their bunks before the guards entered, as though expecting company rather than command. The soldiers noticed too. Their stiffness eased. Some leaned casually against the doorframes, smiling, chatting in broken phrases. Photographs were passed around. Wives, children, sweethearts. Proof that humanity existed on both sides of the wire. A few guards carried pocket dictionaries, fumbling through German sentences that made the women laugh. That laughter, light and fragile, was the sound of surrender, not to an enemy, but to the truth that everything they had believed about that enemy was wrong. Helga, one of the women, captured it perfectly in her diary. When the knock came, we screamed, for we believed the lies. When they handed us chocolate, we cried, for we realized the truth. Everything we had been told was false. Our enemies are stronger than us, not because they are cruel, but because they do not need cruelty. That first knock at the door never faded from memory. It marked not destruction, but awakening. A collapse born not from bombs or barbed wire, but from sweetness, from mercy, from the bewildering generosity of the victors. For women who had braced themselves for violation, the gift of chocolate became the most devastating weapon of all, because it shattered the illusion their leaders had built. And so, as the sweltering summer of 1944 melted into the crisp winds of autumn, the camp, once a symbol of dread, became a quiet stage for revelation. It was there, in the echo of boots and the soft rattle of knuckles against wood, that terror gave way to tears, and tears gave way to understanding. They had entered captivity expecting torment. Instead, they had stumbled into a world where kindness itself was a form of victory. What followed was even stranger. The rhythm of captivity, once marked by dread, began to feel like a fragile version of life. A life that, in some ways, was richer, cleaner, even more civilized than what many had known back home before the war. Once the initial shock faded, the fruit baskets, the laughter, the chocolate, the women began to truly look around. And what they saw was not deprivation, but abundance cloaked in simplicity. The barracks, though rough and hurriedly built from wood, felt like palaces compared to the bombed ruins of German cities. There were electric lights, actual lights, that flared alive with a flick of a switch. For many, it was the first time since the blackout orders of 1940 they had seen a room stay bright through the night. One diary confessed, "We left the lamps burning just to test if the power would fail. It never did. The electricity flows here without end." But even more miraculous was the water. Real running water, hot and cold, pouring freely from metal taps. Showers that never sputtered out, that ran as long as one wished. Women who had rationed water by the cup now stood beneath steaming cascades, letting months of grime and fear wash away. One nurse from Cologne wrote that she cried each time she washed her hair, not from sorrow, but from sheer disbelief at how effortless it felt to be clean again. "At home, my sisters wash in buckets," she wrote. "But here the water falls like rain, heated by invisible fire. They waste miracles on us." The camp kitchens became classrooms in American plenty. Massive gas ranges hissed and roared, their blue flames licking at iron pots. Ovens baked loaves of bread in endless rotation, while walk-in refrigerators held mountains of meat and vegetables in quantities that defied belief. Women who once scraped potato skins into watery soups now learned to cook with beef, milk, eggs, and butter, luxuries they hadn't seen in years. At first, they devoured everything placed before them, eating until their stomachs rebelled against the sudden flood of richness. But soon, the abundance itself became dizzying. Leftovers appeared on every table. The sight of uneaten bread or discarded meat sent a pang straight to the heart. Many stood staring at the waste bins, eyes wet, haunted by memories of hungry families back home. Yet the guards insisted, "Cook more than needed. Always have surplus. If it's not eaten, throw it away." The logic made no sense to minds shaped by scarcity. "We discard in one day," a prisoner wrote, more food than my family saw in a month. It feels like a sin, but here it's simply routine. Outside the kitchens, astonishment continued at every turn. Workshops buzzed with rows of sewing machines, not one or two, but entire lines of them, humming as women mended uniforms or stitched garments. In nearby offices, typewriters clattered like small engines, as some women were assigned clerical work, copying records or assisting American officers with paperwork. And then there was the sound, the music. Radios crackled with bright swinging rhythms, a dazzling contrast to the grim martial marches of the Reich. Jazz and swing, music once condemned as degenerate, now filled the air of their captivity. One diarist confessed, "I tried to cover my ears, for this was forbidden music. Yet my foot tapped before I could stop it." It was during work details outside the camp, however, that the deepest shocks awaited them. Small groups were taken to farms, hospitals, and kitchens to help ease labor shortages caused by the war. And for the first time, the women saw American civilian life with their own eyes. They were stunned. What had been described to them as chaos and moral decay looked instead like strength and equality in motion. Black workers drove tractors. Women handled heavy machinery. Teenagers commanded equipment worth more than an entire German household. One moment burned itself into memory. A farm outside Houston. A young German nurse treated a cut on an African-American laborer's hand, bracing herself for disgust or cruelty from the white foreman. But none came. The man was treated with respect, bandaged carefully, and given the same hearty lunch as everyone else. She wrote that night, trembling, "In Germany, men like him are less than animals. Here, he drives a machine larger than my family's home and eats food richer than our officers." Another woman, taken to a cotton gin, gasped as the machine thundered to life, processing in 1 hour what her entire village could not accomplish in a month. Electricity poured endlessly through belts and pulleys, turning labor into effortless abundance. "The waste of power is magnificent," she wrote. "Fans spin in empty rooms, lights burn without purpose. It is the carelessness of infinite supply." For those with medical training, the most devastating revelation came inside the camp hospital. There, medicines and equipment long vanished from Germany were used casually, even on prisoners. Penicillin, still a myth in Europe, was applied without hesitation to the smallest wounds. X-ray machines hummed quietly. Surgical tools gleamed beneath white lights. Cabinets overflowed with drugs and gauze. One German doctor stood frozen before a shelf of sulfur medicines and whispered, "Our soldiers are dying for these." For nurses who had held dying men in their arms, the sight was unbearable. "They use miracles even on us," one recorded bitterly. In Germany, heroes die for want of bandages. But perhaps the most shattering realization didn't come from machines or medicine. It came from the casual normalcy of American life. Farmers owned tractors worth more than entire German neighborhoods. Factory workers, mocked by Nazi propaganda as exploited weaklings, drove to work in their own cars. Children carried lunchboxes filled with more meat and fruit than German soldiers had seen in weeks. Housewives in small towns wore dresses made from fabrics long extinct in Europe, bought from stores that never seemed to empty. And the abundance wasn't reserved for generals or elites. It was for everyone. The women were torn between wonder and guilt. To eat while their families starved felt like betrayal. To laugh at a guard's clumsy joke while their cities burned under Allied bombs felt like treason. And yet, they couldn't deny what they saw. Day after day, they witnessed a nation not crumbling under war, but thriving through it. Their diaries became battlegrounds of emotion. Awe mingled with shame. "If my mother knew I ate meat twice in one day," one wrote, "she would curse me. But how can I refuse? Here, food is endless." By the close of autumn, camp life had settled into an uncanny normalcy. Lights flickered on at dusk without fail. Water flowed endlessly from taps. Meals arrived in abundance, 3 times each day. They sewed. They cooked. They typed. Their hands stayed busy, but their minds spun relentlessly. Everything around them defied the image they'd been taught since childhood. They had been raised to believe in their superiority, that their enemies were weak, decadent, inferior. That scarcity was purity, and sacrifice was noble. But every morning, they woke to the hum of electricity. Every night, they ate more than they'd seen in years. Every encounter revealed dignity given even to those Germany called subhuman. And in that quiet, unshakable contradiction, their beliefs began to crumble. Captivity had not broken them through chains or cruelty, but through abundance, through comfort, through the disarming strength of a society that conquered not with fear, but with generosity, the kind that even its enemies could not help but envy. Daily life in America wasn't merely routine, it was a revelation. Every bite of bread, every turn of a sewing machine, every flicker of an X-ray beam whispered the same haunting truth. Everything they had been taught was a lie. By late 1944, the mood within the camps had shifted. No longer just survival, but something deeper, something the Americans quietly began calling ideological collapse. What had begun with a knock at the door and a bar of chocolate had evolved into a daily confrontation with a reality Nazi propaganda could never justify. Women who once trembled at the echo of marching boots now sat calmly at wooden tables, turning the fragile pages of American newspapers. They read about battles, elections, and debates written in a language of truth, a language that bore no resemblance to the rehearsed lies of the Reich. The camp libraries offered shelves filled with books in both English and German, and slowly, cautiously, the women began to compare. They found contradictions, newspapers that argued with each other, editorials that disagreed openly, and they realized something unthinkable. In this enemy nation, disagreement wasn't punished, it was printed. The concept was so alien to their upbringing that many reread the same articles over and over, trying to convince themselves their eyes were not deceiving them. Soon, English lessons were introduced. Some joined eagerly, hungry to understand this new world. Others hesitated, afraid that curiosity might be seen as weakness. Yet, as new words formed on their tongues, their world began to widen. They didn't just learn grammar, they absorbed fragments of culture, bits of slang, the rhythm of American songs that drifted from the radios beyond the fences. University professors, many of them refugees who had once fled Germany itself, arrived to give lectures on science, literature, and economics. The irony was almost too much to bear. Men and women who had been cast out by Nazi ideology now stood before German prisoners, teaching them not with vengeance, but with patience. They spoke to us as students, not as enemies, one woman later wrote, astonished that those her country had despised treated her with dignity her own nation had denied. Then came December, and with it the true breaking point. The scent of pine, faint notes of Christmas carols, and the ache of homesickness filled the air. The prisoners expected nothing, perhaps a short sermon, maybe an extra ration. But what came next left them stunned. The camp gates opened to a wave of goodwill. American churches, schools, and local organizations had gathered gifts for the prisoners. Boxes filled with soap, warm socks, candy, cigarettes, and cards written by children. Choirs from nearby towns arrived to sing carols, in German. Their voices rose into the cold evening, carrying melodies the women hadn't heard since home. Women from surrounding towns sent cakes, cookies, and pastries. Some neatly wrapped with ribbons, others in decorated tins covered with holly. The reaction was overwhelming. Hardened auxiliaries who had crossed the Atlantic terrified and defiant now wept openly as they unwrapped small bars of soap or bit into a piece of gingerbread. "They treat us as if we were their own," one wrote in disbelief. "We are the enemy, and yet they give us Christmas." Another confessed softly, "If this is defeat, may our people learn to be defeated." That night, laughter and tears mingled in the barracks as they passed around the small parcels, marveling not at their worth, but that they existed at all. Their captors, who had every reason to hate them, had chosen kindness instead. The dissonance was impossible to ignore. These were the Americans they had been told were cruel, corrupt, and weak. Yet here they were, offering generosity at the height of their own victory. A few tried to cling to suspicion, insisting it was manipulation, some kind of propaganda wrapped in sugar. But most knew better. The Americans had no need to pretend. They were winning the war. The Allies were advancing on every front. Mercy shown in victory wasn't weakness, it was strength. And the prisoners could feel that truth in their bones. As the final days of the year slipped away, many began to turn their gaze inward. They questioned everything. The sacrifices they'd been told were noble, the hunger and scarcity they had been taught to endure with pride, the superiority that blinded them to the humanity of others. Little by little, the certainty drilled into them since childhood began to crumble. They saw that America's greatest weapon wasn't its bombers or its tanks. It was its ability to live freely, to create abundance, and to offer dignity even to its foes. One prisoner put it best in a line that passed secretly from hand to hand. America's strength is not in its guns, but in its mercy. They feed us better than we fed our children. They grant us small freedoms even while we are prisoners. How can we hate those who treat us better than our own? No barbed wire could contain that realization. And so, the daughters of the Reich found themselves standing before a truth as blinding as the electric lights glowing above their bunks each night. The world they had been promised was false, and the world they now saw was real. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the announcement of repatriation came. They would soon return home. Yet the news brought not joy, but tears that few could explain. They had dreamed of Germany, of their families, their streets, their language beyond the fences. But when the day arrived, sorrow overshadowed their joy. They weren't leaving behind cruelty. They were leaving behind a world that, against all logic, had treated them with respect and humanity. As the trains rolled north and east toward the ports, the women stared through the windows, silent and heavy-hearted. They had seen the cities, farms, and factories of America. Places where the lights never went out, where store shelves stayed full, where children laughed even as war raged overseas. Now they were going back to rubble, back to silence, back to a world they no longer recognized. Those who finally returned to Hamburg found little more than the ghost of a city, a burned-out skeleton of what once was. Berlin lay in ruins, a vast graveyard of stone and ash. Families torn apart, streets hollowed by fire, hunger gnawing at every door. Into that wasteland, the women carried stories that sounded almost impossible to those left behind. They spoke of barracks where toilets flushed with running water, of meals that included meat every single day, of doctors who used penicillin even on prisoners. Some listeners laughed in disbelief. Others turned away in quiet envy. Yet their words took root. Quietly, they planted an idea that perhaps not all enemies were monsters, and that when the rubble was cleared, a different kind of world might be possible. For a few, America became more than just a memory. Some had formed bonds with guards or had felt kindness from local families during captivity. Within a few short years, they crossed the ocean again, not as prisoners, but as brides. They married former soldiers, settling in small towns half a world away. Others stayed behind in Germany, rebuilding their lives among ruins. Yet the connections they had made endured. Letters crossed the Atlantic for decades. Envelopes filled with photographs of newborns, handwritten recipes, condolences, and holiday greetings. Between women who had once been enemies, friendships quietly flourished. For those who had once seen America as a caricature of weakness, it became instead a symbol of generosity, of resilience, of a nation built not on conquest but on confidence. But the most profound transformation happened within. These same women, who had once raised their hands in oath to Hitler, who had believed without question in the superiority of their race, now spoke with humility of how those beliefs had crumbled. The Reich had taught them that greatness was born from suffering. That strength came through domination, obedience, and sacrifice. But America showed them something entirely different. A nation that built abundance not through fear, but through freedom, through work, through faith in progress, and a quiet courage, strong enough to show mercy even to those who had once stood against it. And once seen, that truth could never be unseen. Years later, when some of them returned as honored guests, they walked once more through the gates of those same camps, not as captives but as friends. One woman, her hair silver with age, paused before the weathered fences and whispered, "We screamed when the guards first appeared. We cried when they brought us chocolate. And in that moment, our world began to change." The others stood in silence, understanding completely, because the real prison they had escaped was never built of barbed wire or concrete, but of lies they had once believed. And what they carried home was not just memory, but transformation. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep these powerful lessons of history alive, reminding us all that even in the darkest times, truth and compassion can still set us free.